Okay, here we are. We are now looking at Harry Englund's Prisoners of Freedom. We're beginning just with chapters 1 and chapters 2. The introduction, I leave it to you to read for yourselves. And his focus here is on Malawi. As you can see, it's a country in southern Africa. And it is a landlocked country between Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zambia. All right, so chapter 1 then, situation of human rights, debating governance and freedom. From early on in the chapter, he raises the opposition that we've encountered this before, that has troubled anthropology with respect to human rights. The notion of culture on the one hand and universalism on the other, and the tensions that arise between an emphasis on cultural particularity and therefore often cultural relativism and universalism on the other hand. But he does it in an unexpected way. So now he notes that on the one hand, Malawians, not all of them, but some of them, blamed their culture, especially how it encouraged people, as it were, to suffer in silence, for the slow adoption of human rights talk in Malawi. But on the other hand, he points out that human rights must make universal claims. By their nature, they must be universal. However, they have to find expression in particular languages. If they're going to be universal, they have to be expressible in particular languages. A task Malawian activists faced, though, was that they thought Chichewa, the national language, so not the official language, but the national language of Malawi, wasn't up to the task of expressing human rights. English, they thought, was the language that was suitable for expressing human rights. So again, English, their official language, the language of government, but not the national language. Here then, we're seeing that culture's not an alternative way of understanding human rights, as it is sometimes presented in arguments for cultural relativism, but rather it's an obstacle to employing them in the first place. Furthermore, though, we can detect an accompanying confidence that English is the universal language of human rights, which kind of suggests that maybe particularism, English as a particular language, can masquerade as universalism. This is a challenge posed by cultural relativists to the purported universalism of human rights quite often. And so then this masquerading would entail both exclusion of other languages and a kind of chauvinism, a kind of pro-English chauvinism. In his first labeled section of the chapter, then he turns to varieties of rights and citizenship. He stresses throughout the book how economic and social rights receive less attention in democratic Malawi than civil and political liberties. So these correspond to different parts of the UN Declaration of Human Rights as well, we'll notice. So then civil and political liberties and the corresponding equation of human rights with freedom. So he's saying that as human rights undergo a translation from English into Chichewa, human rights become equated with freedom, but not with economic and social rights. This, he thinks, marginalizes the poor within human rights talk. He does not, however, propose any kind of simple inversion of economic and social rights and civil and political liberties. So he asserts that civil and political liberties cannot just be set aside the way that some leaders have done, saying that economic prosperity has to come first. Once we have economic prosperity, then we can have civil and political liberties. So he's not saying that, but also that people cannot enjoy political and civil liberties as long as social and economic rights remain rudimentary. And although Englund explains that we might think of human rights as intrinsic to individuals or as involving obligations between people, what interests him is, quote, the extent to which rights discourse enables subjects to claim entitlements. And so we can think of entitlement roughly along the lines of social and economic rights. In human rights thought, the state is the entity that attends to entitlements. States do this with respect to their citizens. So now we have a new problem. The idea of citizen starts to sneak in to displace the idea of the human in human rights. So that is, rights that human rights theory conceives as intrinsic and inalienable for all humans because of intrinsic dignity turn out to be available only within states and handled through state judicial apparatuses. So that then now citizenship, not just humanness, becomes an issue for human rights. Englund's point is that human rights are situated within, as he says, arguments about membership in political society, not through arguments that depend on the concept of abstract humanity. Again then, the idea of who is included in political society is a citizen and thus may claim rights through the state's judicial apparatus, raises the question of exclusion from political society, because the question of who's included always implies the question of who's excluded. We'll see that a significant part of the explanation for the equation of human rights with freedom has to do with how consideration of human rights occurred within larger political discussions of post-coloniality and democracy in Malawi. Englund draws attention to the fact that emerging democracies in Africa largely started by thinking of citizens as individual, but importantly, individuals on a neoliberal model. And this spurred neoliberal reforms organized around privatization and the prioritization of individuals' entrepreneurial essence. So that we're all on the same page, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is an outstanding resource, writes, neoliberalism is now generally thought to label the philosophical view that a society's political and economic institutions should be robustly liberal and capitalist, but supplemented by a constitutionally limited democracy with a modest welfare state. So in essence, it promotes the idea of privatizing whatever can be privatized and allowing market relations to mediate a whole host of relations that have previously been handled between the state and citizens. The result of this convergence of neoliberalism and democratic emergence in much of Africa is that the conceptualization of citizenship has rested on, as he puts it, political rights at the expense of socioeconomic justice. Again, this will be a theme that recurs through the book. So in a way, I think what we can see in this opening chapter is if we think of Englund as something like a juggler. There are a number of balls that he has in the air at once, but some of them he's thrown quite high up, and they're going to come down and return into circulation later on in the book. So he's setting things up now that he's going to come back to over and over through the rest of the book. Okay, moving on. So now we can recall that Englund has explained how this set of discussions around democracy provided the frame for discussion of human rights, situating the discussion of human rights, to recall the title of his chapter. Visualizing human rights here also through a neoliberal lens, emphasizing freedom, not economic and social rights. Freedom then was pitched against entitlements, with freedom winning, entitlements losing, albeit with some discouragement of political participation and organization behind collective rights claims. So then some political elites were discouraging collective argumentation, collective agitation, collective dissent. Despite the political situation of human rights, so again, the idea here being that human rights discourse is situated within political discussions that are going on around democracy and post-coloniality. Okay, so despite this political situation, many contributors to human rights discourse politicize the situation of human rights. That is, human rights discourses and practices depoliticized the exercise of power so that it emphasized state exercises of power in a depoliticized way, but also market relations in a depoliticized way. For example, by avoiding public criticism of the government and political leaders. At the same time, the exercise of power to determine who has a say over who has a standing to make a claim or speak on political matters maintains human rights political situation by excluding some voices. And again, we will see that the voices largely excluded from this discussion, those who are excluded from having standing to discuss these things will be the poor. Another way to put this, then, is that on the one hand, activist concerns and discourses did not make their way into, as it were, popular vocabularies. We'll come back to this in the next chapter on translation. While on the other hand, discourse about human rights in the abstract tended to bury actual contests over the constitution of human rights. So then the promotion of an abstract human, of the citizen in the abstract, buried particular claims, particular disputes that individuals and collectivities carried out in the name of human rights. He says, a fundamental problem is that subjects' uneven capacity to be heard in human rights discourse that delineates the public sphere less as a realm of rational deliberation than as a site of power. So as the keep right sign that pointed left a few slides back suggested, there's a kind of misdirection in presenting a site of power as if it were an arena of rational deliberation to which everyone had equal access with an equal voice. Englund turns to the concept of governmentality to explore this. He explains that the analysis of governance cannot remain at the level of the state, given that the states are themselves subject to forces that lie outside of them, like international markets, and because there are influential non-state actors that perform state-like functions. So we could think of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank as just two candidates for this kind of non-state actor that performs state-like functions. Now, he draws on Foucault's concept of governmentality to gain a clear sense of how and where governance occurs. Foucault coined the term governmentality to help think about an important change in government that frankly still remains with us. It's the shift in emphasis from governing territory to producing and governing a population. He explains it like this. That is, Englund explains it like this. Foucault's innovation was to depict the practices of government in the plural and to locate them even in the most intimate realms of family, let alone such domains as education, religion, and law. Governmentality thus refers to the conduct of conduct. So you can think of conduct as having two senses here. Conduct, like how you conduct yourself, how you comport yourself, how you carry on, but also conduct in the sense of like a conductor before a band. The conduct of conduct, then, is the sort of the catchphrase for governmentality. conduct of conduct, the acts and norms of governing, from state institutions to a plurality of agencies and authorities, to aspects of personal behavior governed as much by self-regulation as by these authorities. So then the individual, excuse me, takes on the burden of self-regulation, so that in many cases the state does not have to carry on the work of regulating the population. It's the work of governmentality is to get individuals to do this work for them. So we can get a picture of governance insinuating itself into the nooks and crannies of our lives, but importantly, because much of the work of governing is done by work that we take on ourselves, that is, with ourselves as the focus. So you can just think of the way that ideas like personal responsibility circulate now in political and legal talk to get a sense of how this insinuates itself into the individual life. For Englund, this is ethnographically interesting because it directs our attention to the concrete ways that people, both inside and outside the formal political system, engage in governing themselves in others. In other words, the notion of governmentality gives us a certain kind of ethnographic prompt to where we can direct our attention. So he points to the way that human rights, translated in Malawi as individual freedom, become a platform for governmentality. He says, the allure of defining human rights as individual freedoms lay in its apparently post-colonial approach to governance. Rights-bearing subjects were free to take up the burdens of governing and developing themselves. So he notes that human rights came to play this governmental role not so much because political elites insisted on it, not that they didn't insist on it, but that's not the only thing at play here, but because human rights activists and their external donor agencies did. In this way, human rights preserved elitism both for political and activist figures. Very briefly then, when he talks about moving beyond Foucault's prison, the prison that he has in mind is the panopticon. Foucault analyzed the panopticon, seen here in a couple of different renderings, as the site of governmentality, in which, so the idea was, prisoners would internalize the gaze of guards and, in essence, police themselves, becoming ideal inmates through their own efforts and discipline. So the notion here is that you have this ring of cells around a central tower. And this is a model of prisons developed by Jeremy Bentham as a kind of humanitarian or a more humane way of incarcerating individuals. In any case, okay, so then you can see that the interior of the cells is completely visible to the central tower. The picture above me here does a better job of this than the picture to the other side, in showing how the interior of the tower is not visible to the inmates in the cells, so that there is complete inequality of visibility here. The prisoners being entirely visible, the guards in the tower being completely invisible to the prisoners. This means then that the prisoners in the cell have to know first that anything that they do in that cell is in principle visible to the tower. And secondly, they can never know when somebody might be watching from the tower to see what they're doing. This is why that, and in fact, in principle, you don't need anyone in the tower. You just need the threat that there might be somebody there watching. And so through this, the prisoner internalizes this gaze of a, at least potential guard, and starts to discipline him or herself without the need of the guards actually interacting with the prisoners at all. Okay, so then that's the model of governmentality, that's a way of approaching thinking about governmentality. We'll see that there's more to it than that, but this is sort of from an early moment in Foucault's writing when he's thinking about surveillance and the internalization of discipline and things like this. Now, Englund is careful not to adopt governmentality in a programmatic way. So it's not that he thinks there's nothing to give us pause here. He points out that activists did not just turn into the free, rights-bearing individuals of neoliberal rhetoric, but also developed a sense of obligation and responsibility to provide welfare. So these are not straightforward products of governmentality, nor of neoliberalism. So there are other things going on here, is what he's pointing out. Now, at the same time, recipients of NGO assistance, the poor or the grassroots as they're sometimes called through the book, they're not simply constrained to the range of maneuver neoliberal rhetoric would suggest either. So that neither governmentality nor neoliberalism, and there's a large overlap between the two, is a completely all-encompassing explanation for what's going on. Englund thinks that ethnography is a way to combat the programmatic impulse in the analysis of governmentality, saying that his fieldwork shows that resistance in the form of human rights claims is not a straightforward response to power. So the idea here being another idea stemming from Foucault's work, that wherever you get the exercise of power, you get the exercise of resistance, with the exception being cases of complete domination where resistance is not possible. Englund is pointing out that not all forms of resistance in the guise of human rights claims are a straightforward response to power, so that linkage is more tenuous than we might think if we're just reading the literature on governmentality. And so in this sense, he's saying that ethnography provides a certain kind of corrective by holding the theory of governmentality up to the facts that he finds on the ground. So what are the ethnographic details that correspond or diverge from governmentality as a theory of internalizing one's own self-development, of the gaze of authority, as it were. Englund explains that ethnographers have shown how ideas of freedom arise in civilizations, in the plural, that are not well described as neoliberal. So then there, again, he has this idea that there's a break between notions of freedom and neoliberalism. They are not in a one-to-one relationship. You can find them in civilizations that you can't well describe as neoliberal. He adds then that such studies demonstrate that projects of self-transformation always occur within social relationships, not through abstract individuality. He points to Foucault's later work on techniques of the self as a way to think about freedom differently than the work on governmentality. So in Foucault's later work, he turns to what he calls the classical age. So we can think of classical Greek writings on things like virtue and how virtue is based in the cultivation of the self, what Foucault coins as techniques of the self. And that this is a way of thinking about freedom differently than through the lens of governmentality. Now it focuses less on how freedom is achieved than how it is exercised in specific circumstances. And the specificity of circumstances is important. Again, you can see why this is something that is appealing to an anthropologist, attending to the specific circumstances in which people exercise freedom. The point here is not that Foucault is wrong in one set of writings and right in the other, but rather that the earlier work on surveillance and dominance, governmentality, illuminating as it was, ran into certain kinds of limits. Englund has already sort of illuminated what some of those might be, and that techniques of the self help to deal with that encounter with limits and undo some of the problems that governmentality, surveillance, and dominance in his earlier writing run into. A large part of Englund's motivation for insisting on approaching human rights in Malawi ethnographically is that it allows him to appreciate how governmentality functions, especially as activists have trouble seeing beyond the horizon that neoliberalism provides for them, and that they, to a large extent, simply take on board. At the same time, ethnography lets him describe people's actions, projects, and priorities beyond the limits of what governmentality provides, and in this way, it avoids some of the all-encompassing explanations and analysis that governmentality tends to offer. Shifting from the critique that governmentality can impose uniformity in the form of neoliberalism or of colonial rule on heterogeneous situations, Englund observes then that the techniques of the self on which people drew, activists, poor people, the grassroots, as he says here, these techniques were also varied. And they included things like missionary education, ideas of communities as wholes, not simply just sort of a collection of individuals who happen to be in the same place at the same time, as if a subway car full of strangers or something like that. We're going to come back to this notion of communities as wholes later. But again, so this is a distinctive way in which people can engage in techniques of the self. And neoliberal ideas are not absent from this scene then, but it turns out then that they are one factor among several. But neoliberal ideas do appear in ideas like the poor being responsible for their own development. Now, even as activists drew on human rights to critique a manipulative regime, so human rights provided them with tools to criticize a political regime that they found manipulative, for example, by trying to extend the number of times that an individual could be elected from 2 to 3 as the leader of the country, right? So human rights did provide a language to launch those kind of critiques. Public debate by activists, though, and authorities only recognized certain human rights and marginalized others, so that even as they were employing the language of human rights to critique elites, at the same time, this kind of bound elites and activists together. They were, so to speak, speaking the same language with each other. Things that concerned other people then, like the poor, got marginalized from those discussions, so that everyday concerns of poverty and exploitation remained on the sidelines to make room for talk of freedoms. A curious aspect of the connection between human rights and governments is how opposing factions then, activists and authorities, forged what Englund calls an uncanny alliance, mutually beneficial dispute organized around the idea of human rights as freedom. So not human rights as economic and social rights, but human rights as freedom. So the government has a stake in freedom in that they position themselves as having displaced authoritarian government with democracy. So they have a clear stake in maintaining this discussion of freedom and presenting themselves as the heroes of a democratic, free Malawi. Activists, of course, were especially concerned, as Englund puts it, about political and civil liberties, precisely the kinds of rights that affirmed their own identity as the harbingers of a new order. So that activists relied as much on these new rights as freedom to be able, for example, to critique the government, as the government relied on them in order to present themselves as the promoters of a free and democratic country. The trick, of course, is that maintaining this focus on freedom did not help to relieve the strains of poverty that preoccupied poor Malawians. So it spoke to elites, both NGO elites and political elites, but not so much to the poor. Instead, both activists and elites wind up maintaining the status quo in this way, the economic status quo at very least, by ignoring the effects of interventions like legal aid in favor of political liberties. Now, finally, Englund takes a moment to note that secular organizations are those sustaining the economic status quo, while it was religious institutions that tried to draw attention to increasing disparities in wealth, even as they remained critical of the political shortcomings of democratic elites. All right, on to the second chapter. Rights as freedoms, translating human rights. So I just want to note here, before we get into this chapter, that Englund is doing something very interesting, and it's an unusual way to approach human rights as a topic of study, in that he's starting with language, and in particular starting with the challenges of translating human rights. It's an uncommon place to start these kinds of studies. So the work in that way is quite innovative. So let's see what he has to say about that. Okay. He summarizes his second chapter in this way. So we're going to the end to see what he says of this chapter. This is how he characterizes what the chapter had set out to do. The focus of this chapter on translation and language use has disclosed how the issue of rights and responsibilities cannot be resolved in the abstract. Again, he's alluding here to the idea of the abstract human being of human rights. By establishing a discourse confined to rights as freedoms, activists, politicians, and other self-proclaimed experts made it extremely difficult to express and pursue alternatives to the current disempowerment of the majority. He goes on to say that the political history of Malawi is central to the explanation of the association of rights with freedoms, and as he just noted above, in the first chapter, with how this history contributed to a, quote, tacit alliance between politicians and politically independent activists centered on a public discourse on freedoms. How then does the discussion of translation get him to these conclusions? That's the work of this chapter. He'll focus on who controls translations and decides what are the appropriate notions, as well as how the country's political history influences the translation that it adopts, and therefore which things it does not adopt. In Malawi, as in Zambia, translation of UN documents related to human rights from English was, he says, a top-down exercise with no evidence of attempts to consult a broad cross-section of native speakers. This fact significantly impeded the development of local cultures of human rights. Instead, elites involved in the translation initiative took their interest in democratization and impressed it upon the translation project, translating, therefore, rights as freedoms. So again, this notion of political and civil liberties that we've already seen introduced well in the first chapter. Englund explains that among the challenges of translation, there are often not one-to-one equivalences between vocabularies. So if, for those who are familiar with both Spanish and English, you'll know then that there's no single word in Spanish for the verb to be or the verb to have. So translating ser, estar, haber, tener in the one direction, to be and to have, in the other will require choices, not a one-to-one correspondence. And don't even get me started on the subjunctive, because in English, we hardly use the subjunctive at all, whereas in Spanish, it's a prominent feature of the language. So once again, you can't simply translate from the one to the other in a one-to-one correspondence, as if there are straightforward equivalencies between them. Okay. He does not dwell on this, but he notes that language and life worlds knit into one another, so that concepts that have life in one language do not necessarily have a life in another. This is the problem that human rights ran into in some African languages, in which specific kinds of relationships become displaced by rules with the introduction of legal language. That is to say, then, that legal language has a way of codifying things as rules, but that that's not necessarily the way that social relationships are lived out within the language of a particular speech community. As an example, he compares Kiswahili and Luganda understandings of rights as related to moral authority, which is not equally distributed in society. That on the one side, and then human rights legalistic discourse, which does rest on a notion of universal equality, so that you can't simply translate rights into, or human rights into, a notion of authority here. As a matter of translation, the concepts just don't line up seamlessly. So it seems that communities would have to make a choice between which one should arbitrate disputes, conflicts, and grievances. They, in a sense, can't both operate at the same time. The stakes of how to introduce human rights in Malawi, to render them in Chichewa, the national language, are high in Englund's view, in that they, quote, can be deprived of their democratizing potential and made to serve particular interests in society. So we may recall here how dignity, a notion drawn from Kant, is a crucial anchor for the assertion of universal human equality that underpins human rights. He says that this threat is intrinsic not to particular words, but to the threat of to the work of translation as not just a linguistic, but also a political and cultural process. Again, this idea that language and life worlds are inextricably knit into one another. The very force of the universal claims of human rights can, in their appeal to the human in the abstract, obscure how these political and cultural processes are at play. The political and cultural situation of translation, again, he talked about this in the previous chapter, includes the attainment of independence from colonial rule. So that's a historical situation in which conversation about rights occurs. And it generated discourses around freedom and national independence. And then following on that, the history of post-colonial dictatorship, during which freedom took on another distinct trajectory in its association with democracy. People articulate notions of human rights then with these senses and sensibilities of freedom in place. This is what informs their discussion about notions of freedom and rights. Englund brings the previous point home in his discussion of the neologism for human rights in Malawi, a pairing of words that I'm not going to attempt to say because I don't speak Swahili. I don't speak Chichewa, so I would massacre it. So I won't, I'll just refer to it then as this neologism, a new term. That is the combining of existing terms in a new way to create a new expression that would do the work of human rights. A phrase meaning the freedom one is born with is not convincing as a way to express a range of rights, he says, but has the added downside of stifling alternative expressions that, for example, may not be so confined to the idea of human rights as freedoms. Again, this idea of stifling alternatives that would include entitlements. He notes two important factors that contributed to the widespread adoption of the neologism. One is the efforts of the post-colonial Malawian government to standardize Chichewa, giving it, as he says, remarkable uniformity, making this particular construction sensible to most speakers. So this neologism, because of this work of standardizing Chichewa, allows the expression to be intelligible or sensible, apprehensible to native speakers. Well, I guess to non-native speakers as well. In any case, to people who can speak the language. And the other is how post-colonial history pushed some aspirations to the forefront. For example, freedom as independence and then freedom as democracy. As Englund has argued, this promotion of freedom came at the expense of alternatives, like entitlement, to those things that satisfy human needs. So again, economic and social rights. As he points out, freedoms do not in themselves erase socioeconomic inequalities, and so the suppression of alternatives is consequential. Englund wants us to take from the previous section that both freedoms and entitlements have equivalents in Chichewa and could therefore both constitute notions of rights. So it's not one or the other. Political history, especially the drive for liberal democracy, prioritized freedom. Relations within the language group became reflected in this privileging of freedom and the marginalization of entitlements. So the relevant social relations influencing the politics of translation are between those who determine what is worth saying and what is not, and those who do not have a say. It's not hard here then to see that political elites benefited from the bolstering of freedom, while ideas of entitlement stood to benefit the poor at the expense of elite power. We can see here how the politics of translation are less about the relationship between languages, strong languages and weak languages, if you will, than relations within a linguistic community. The quality of translation is another issue that compromised the ability of human rights to serve the interests of poor people. First, there was an attitude among both activists and officials that translation was a straightforward question of, quote, explaining an issue expressed in one language in the words of another. Again, this idea that there can be one-to-one correspondences, and it's a simple matter of finding what those correspondences are. That's it. Hence, there is a sense that anyone competent in English would do to produce a translation. Second, there was a kind of a patronizing attitude on the part of those promoting human rights towards those they saw as beneficiaries of their work. In other words, Englund writes, activists and officials saw their fluency in human rights discourse as an index of their own expertise. Translation or consultation or conversation with the impoverished recipients was therefore never given serious consideration. So he notes too the poor quality control of translations, sometimes with multiple spellings of the same word within a single passage, which suggests inattention. Given that these documents will be the main thing available for poor people to read on human rights, the risk uh, it, this inattention or this lack of quality control risks leaving these readers with unclear documents to work out what human rights are about and what sort of work human rights could do for them. Englund examines two translations of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, one by the UN in Zambia, the other by a Malawian human rights organization, to clarify how translation can disempower Chichewa speakers. He draws attention to the way that the right to join trade unions, a right enumerated in the Declaration of Human Rights, to protect one's interests, after translation completely leaves out the notion of interests and instead speaks only of the right to join trade unions in one case and the vaguely phrased opportunity to be a member of any organization that assists his or her well-being. He notes that the specific economic and social rights that the English version outlines disappear under this kind of obscure language that leans more on general ideas of freedom than rights oriented to workers' interests. So the English version reads, "Everyone has the right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of his interests." Other articles, like Article 22 on rights to social security and the free development of one's personality, present different problems because they rest on presumptions of social and political structures, like the presence of the modern state, that may not be universal features of human sociality and social organization. And even if a community exists within a state, it may not be the principal way of organizing themselves, handling disputes, and so on. Englund finds that the translations not only have had to contend with concepts that have little, if any, life in the Chichewa reading communities, but also remove any sense of entitlements that Article 22 proclaims. And again, the idea here is that the things that might be of most immediate concern for poor people in Malawi have to do with their economic viability, and therefore entitlements may be extremely important human rights to be able to lay claim to. So marginalizing them or smothering them or simply not acknowledging them has important consequences. So these are not just errors, Englund thinks. Rather, they raise the question of whose interests the translations serve. So Article 22 reads, "Everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation, and in accordance with the organization and resources of each state, of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality." Englund then extends his concern with the interest of translators in this section. Human rights discourse gives rise to claims. This is all a quote by him, by the way. Human rights discourse gives rise to claims while setting a frame in which those claims can be expressed. In this regard, how the discourse is introduced into particular languages is highly consequential because this also influences what kind of claims people can make by using their languages. The translation of human rights discourse is informed by the translator's interests. In Malawi and Zambia, he reminds us, the criteria for recruiting translators had less to do with professional qualifications than on the recruiting organization's interests. And so in this way, inequality was baked into the translations from the outset. Translations that were kind of designed to speak to the interests of the organization sponsoring the translation, not necessarily the interests of those who would claim human rights. This inequality is not just a feature of the translations, but was also reflected in the choices of which documents to translate. So that not everything that the UN has produced on human rights will find a translation into Chichewa. They make choices of which to translate, and so this is what he's pointing to. Notably, international human rights documents and national laws that promoted social and economic rights remained available only in English, while those translated equated rights with individual freedoms. Englund takes as an example the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, a document that stresses collective as well as individual rights, including, for example, quote, the possibility that persons may be exposed to injury not only as individuals, but as the bearers of particular social identities. The Malawian translation, however, he says, fails to seize on this alternative way of conceiving of rights, opting for a generic people rather than peoples, so deflating any kind of sense of plurality or variety of peoples, and that neutralizes precisely the risk that the Charter aims to eliminate. The translation of the Constitution, the Malawian Constitution that is, had similar problems, both in the text and in the uses to which activists have put it. Although it has important sections recognizing citizens' entitlements, the translation tends to put these instead as freedoms, not as entitlements. This has not rendered the Constitution inert for activists. Activists have been able to use it for a variety of ends. But even then, the uses to which they put it lean heavily on sections concerned with freedoms, not with social and economic justice. The potential costs of not raising issues beyond civil and political liberties is significant. He says, the focus on individual freedoms may, in point of fact, disempower the vast majority of Malawians by depriving them of key concepts and legal provisions. Obscured is the fact that people generally pursue freedoms from unequal positions. Alongside the emphasis on freedom, there emerged talk of too much freedom, ironically enough, especially with respect to children and discipline on the one hand, and to marginalized people like youths and some women who, for example, adopt unconventional clothing, who then could be targeted as, quote, obstacles in Malawi's transformation, the transformation toward a modern, prosperous democracy. Englund describes the consequences of this parallel discourse like this. And again, this whole passage is a quotation. When the authorities entrusted to promote students and women were unable to offer better analysis than this, their own contribution to disempowerment was all too apparent. The discourse on too much freedom obscured the causes of discontent among marginalized Malawians and focused on the mere symptoms of a socioeconomic crisis. Just as students were taken to be responsible for a chaotic situation in underperforming schools, so too were young women made the causes of rape for wearing clothes that, as one official put it, encourage men to rape. So again, the notion here then is that this discourse of too much freedom misattributes certain kinds of discontent and dissent based on poverty, on lack of access to decent education, and so forth. It takes those things and it refashions them as too much freedom. Students are acting up not because their schools are inadequate, but because they have too much freedom. You get the point here, hopefully. In this way, human rights and democracy receive blame for creating lawlessness by encouraging overindulgence in freedom. Again, in a sense, systematically misrecognizing the problems that generate discontent dissent, and so forth. A second parallel discourse focused on responsibilities, that is, as a complement to rights and freedoms, also emerged. The trick with this was that it rested on a notion of abstract free individuals, again, the abstract human of human rights, whose reciprocal freedoms and responsibilities inferred equality between them. So the idea here is that my rights impress upon you certain kinds of responsibilities and restrictions. Equally, your rights, the same rights that I possess, impose upon me certain kinds of restrictions. I can't just do anything that I want because some of those things might violate your rights. Your rights impinge upon my legitimate capacity to act however I wish. But this notion, this kind of abstract notion, he says, makes the presumption that we start off in equal positions and that this reciprocation is on an even playing field. And this then is how Malawians were encouraged to consider one another, quote, not as marginalized youths and privileged authorities or as young women and adult men. Obscured, once again, were power relations, structural inequalities that made the assumption of reciprocity a grievous error. To return to the opening section for this chapter, we should now have a clear picture of why rights and responsibilities cannot be resolved in the abstract, but require attention to the specific character of social relations, and hence, again, his particular interest in approaching this ethnographically rather than through the lens of a kind of abstract set of principles. All right, that is it. That brings us to the end of chapter 2. Thank you, and I will see you back here for chapters 3 and 4.